Chapter 71 Making Pasta. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Frank awoke from his slumber late in the afternoon. He had spent the last few nights partying with his friends and was now hungover beyond belief. He struggled to get up from under his covers, but ultimately managed to find his footing. After some effort, he managed to find his way to the stairs, where he descended them cautiously while holding on to the handrail. When he entered the kitchen area, he could smell the scent of baked ziti in the oven. This instantly surprised him, as he did not know what the time was. When he rounded the corner, his mother looked at him with a stern expression before chastising him for his scandalous actions throughout the weekend. "Well, it's good to see that my son is still alive. Were you out drinking again?" The words the woman spoke felt like a cheese grater against Frank's brain, and the fluorescent lighting wasn't helping. He stumbled towards a stool at the counter, where he sat down and sunk his head into his arms. "Ugh! Not so loud. I have a massive headache." In response to this, the woman scoffed before handing a bottle of painkillers to her son. "Take these. You really shouldn't be out partying so much." In response to this, Frank smirked as he swallowed the pills with the aid of a cup of water. He shook his head as if he was lecturing the woman. "I'm in the prime of my youth, and it's the 4th of July weekend. Of course I'm going to a party." Frank's mother shook her head in disappointment. She could not have her teenage son going out for the weekend and partying with strangers. The woman had decided to put her foot down. She pulled out a bunch of baking materials and sat them out in front of Frank with a livid expression in her eyes. Frank immediately questioned what she was doing. "What the hell is this?" The woman immediately flicked his head before responding to his question with a stern tone. "Language. This is your punishment. I've just run out of noodles, and was about to go to the store to buy more. However, it would appear that you are in need of punishment, so I'm going to have you make noodles for me." Frank felt as if he was listening to an alien language. His brow raised as he struggled to understand what his mother was saying. "Make noodles? How do I do that?" In response to this, the woman smirked before dragging her son off of his stool by his ear. "I'll show you. First, we start off with flour. Pour 2 cups of it into the bowl. Next, you add 2 teaspoons of salt from there. You combine it together with a fork, so it is nice and mixed." Frank did as his mother instructed him, with a pained expression on his face. He was not expecting to help his mother cook while he was hungover. After he had mixed the bowl properly, his mother began to give him his next instructions. "Now you add the eggs and milk to the bowl. Repeat the process of using your fork to stir and combine the products. Then you knead it together and let it rest on the counter for 10 minutes. Frank cracked a couple of eggs into the bowl before pouring 2 tablespoons of milk into. After doing this, he followed his mother's instructions and combined it. Where he proceeded to knead the dough together and let it rest for the appropriate amount of time. While Frank was wrist deep in dough, his mother made him a Bloody Mary, which she handed off to him with a standoffish expression as he finished his task. "Drink this. While I don't condone your behavior, I can't bear to see my baby boy suffer so much." Frank smiled when he saw his mother acting like her normal self. He quickly gulped down the Bloody Mary and said a brief prayer he heard on a cartoon dedicated to animated spies. For this, his extremely religious mother smacked him on the back of the head and scolded him once more. "What was that?" Frank merely scoffed as he responded to his mother's claims. "It was a joke, I saw it on TV." The woman merely glared at him. They did not continue their discussion and sat in silence for 10 minutes until the pasta dough was ready for the next step. She scattered flour onto a cutting board before showing her son how to roll the dough until it was about 1/4 of an inch thick. After the mother-son duo did this, she showed him the remaining steps, which were to cut the dough into noodles with a knife. Having properly made the noodles, Frank's mother boiled water and handled the rest, keeping these doughy noodles in boiling water for 3 minutes before straining them. With that, the noodles were complete, and the woman added them to her ziti mix. The two of them ate in silence as they tasted the fruits of their combined labor. Finally, after the meal was done, the woman complimented her son for his work. "You did well. Hopefully one day you will be proficient in cooking enough to make your own meals." Frank chuckled before thanking his mother. "Thanks, Mom." After saying this, Marcellus awoke from his dream. Finally, he had the last component he needed to truly taste chicken Alfredo as he had eaten it in a prior vision. At this point, he no longer even bothered to try to comprehend his dreams. They were just a part of who he was now. He did not know why they started, or what were their origins, but he did not care. They seemed to be oddly nostalgic and warming. He decided not to think about it, and just learn from the lessons taught within them. After coming to this conclusion, he hopped out of his bed where Sigefrida was still sleeping. He decided not to wake her up, and to make breakfast for his household. After all, he wanted to put the two components of Alfredo together into one dish. Thus, he silently rushed off to the kitchen where he got to work. Some time had passed, and eventually, both Placidia and Sigefrida came to the kitchen. The sun was shining through the palace windows, and Marcellus had a wide grin on his face as he poured the noodle dish onto their plates. The two women gazed in shock at Marcellus, as they recognized only part of the dish. Placidia was the first to comment on this strange new invention. "What is this?" Marcellus was happy to explain his newest invention to the two women. "These strips are called pasta. It came to me in a dream, and I figured they would go great with Alfredo. Go ahead, eat up and tell me how you like it." The two women had differing expressions on their faces. Sigefrida seemed concerned about Marcellus' mental health after having two strange dreams about cooking in a row. He had never been much of a cook and relied on her to make his meals in the past. Yet he had suddenly come up with two very different types of food. Placidia, on the other hand, was excited and eagerly gulped down the dish before exclaiming her surprise aloud. It is really good. I think I like Alfredo with this pasta more than by itself." Upon hearing this, Sigefrida put her concerns aside and quickly got to work devouring the dish. She also shared the same opinion as Placidia. They both ate in silence and only voiced their thoughts when they had completed their meal. Meanwhile, Marcellus had also dined on his portion and was very pleased with the results. Placidia was eager to see if Marcellus had any other bright ideas about the culinary arts. "Do you have any other dishes? This could be huge. This is entirely different from anything I have ever tasted before." Marcellus sighed heavily when he heard this and shook his head in response. "Sadly, I have not thought up of anything else. But who knows, maybe in the future I will have some new ideas that come to me. Either way, it seems like we have another new dish to introduce to our palate. Perhaps I can sell this new dish I have created for profit." Placidia was quick to encourage Marcellus on the idea. "Go for it. I'm sure you can find some vacant property and have some cooks learn how to make this dish. You could have them sell this to the public for a fair price. I'm sure it would be popular." Marcellus nodded his head in agreement. He also thought it was a good idea to generate revenue. It may not be much, but it was better than keeping the knowledge to himself. Thus, he decided to open up a restaurant as a side business and see how his newest creation fared. Chapter 72 Meeting with the Huns. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Months had passed since the Eastern Roman Empire had learned of Marcellus's rise to power, and it was now the dead of winter. For whatever reason, the leader of the Huns, who was a man by the name of Uldan, did not desire to meet with Aulus Pontitius Frugi until this very moment. After months of currying favor with the barbarians, Frugi was finally granted an audience. Frugi currently stood in a Hunnic tent where the leader of their people sat in silence, facing the opposite direction. The man was surrounded by bodyguards who glared at the intruder with menacing gazes. It was only after several moments of waiting did Frugi dare to speak. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Aulus Pontitius Frugi, Magister Militum of the Eastern Roman Empire. I have come to you on behalf of the Emperor Theodosius II to negotiate an alliance with your people. While I know you are technically allied with the Western Roman Empire, I also know that the Emperor Honorius is now dead, and unless you have renegotiated with the usurper who has taken his place, then your loyalties to the West have ended. Silence prevailed for several moments before the sound of laughter erupted from the man who was facing the other side of the room. Ulden turned around to reveal his heavily scarred visage as he laughed at the translator who spoke Frugi's words to him. He pointed at the translator and then to Frugi before speaking in his native tongue. Tell this Roman dog that I am not interested in fighting his wars for him. It is true that the deal between me and that fool Honorius has concluded, but that does not mean I wish to fight against the Western Roman army or its current emperor. Ask this man if he knows how many forces this Titus Claudius Marcellus has at his disposal. The man translated Ulden's words to the Eastern Roman representative, which caused Frugi to scoff in displeasure. He was dumbfounded that Ulden would even ask such a ludicrous question. Of course, he knew about the military might that Marcellus had been available to him, and it paled in comparison to those under the Eastern Roman army's command. Thus, he wore a shit-eating grin as he informed the man of what he knew. Marcellus has approximately 54,000 Roman soldiers beneath his command, and all of which are either conscripts or part-time border guards. They stand no match against the forces of Theodosius, nor against your own army. Why should you fear this usurper and his army of unarmored plebeians? When the translated conveyed his thoughts to the leader of the Huns, Ulden broke out into a fit of laughter before cursing the Eastern Roman general as a fool. This response immediately took Frugi off guard, who could not understand why the man was laughing at him until the translator converted his words into Latin. You are a fucking idiot. You act as if you know everything about your enemy, but in reality you know nothing. The information you have provided me is months old. While you sat on your asses, this so-called usurper has trained his conscripts to be a capable force, and equipped them with the best arms and armor available. I dare to say even my 10,000 riders are no match for the 3,000 cataphracts that man has in his army. The Western cavalry would cut through my horsemen like wheat to the scythe should we be foolish enough to engage them in battle. When these words were translated to Frugi, he reacted in a fit of rage, condemning Ulden as a liar to his face. That is a lie. It takes many years to raise a troop of cataphracts. How could he have mustered so many in such a short time span? Ulden broke out into laughter once more when he heard this. Apparently these fools had done little investigation into the rapid armament and training of Marcellus' forces. Though Ulden did not know what sorcery the Western Romans used to so quickly train men on how to ride their mounts, he knew that his scouts would not dare lie to him. He decided to impart a bit of wisdom to the representative from the eastern portion of the empire. My guess is these cataphracts were quickly raised by some foreign means. Though I doubt they would be the greatest asset on the battlefield with the limited time they have had to train. Come spring, when you finally launch your attack against the West, they will be more than capable of dealing with your armies. It is not the cataphracts you need to worry about, but the 9 legions that have been raised from the conscripts. I do not know what reforms Marcellus has put his armies through, but they are no longer organized to the same standards as Honorius' pathetic forces. When Frugi heard that the 54,000 men of the Western Roman army had been organized into 9 legions, he felt as if he was hearing a historian speak of the long-distant past. He could hardly believe Marcellus would do such a thing. He immediately questioned how the man knew this information. How do you know all of this? Ulden chuckled when he heard the translator repeat Frugi's words. He would not conceal the truth of the matter even if it angered the East. BL.net, because agents from the West have already sought to reincorporate us into their federati, they boasted of their strength, and my scouts and merchants reported these claims to be accurate. I don't know what expense Marcellus had spent on ensuring his army was well trained, and well equipped, but these are not the simple peasant conscripts you thought they would be. They are well armed and well organized. If you wish to press your boy Emperor's claim on the West, it will be a costly affair, to say the least, and we will have no part in it. Now leave, or I will have my men tear you to pieces. Frigi felt like he should curse the man for his cowardice but chose not to. Provoking a conflict with the Huns was the last thing the Eastern Roman Empire needed at the moment, especially since many of them had already settled in their lands. He could only sigh in defeat and leave the Hunnic encampment. The only good news to come from these failed negotiations was the fact that the Huns were not loyal to the West anymore. Frigi could hardly believe what Odin had said to him. It was one thing to conscript 54,000 peasants, but to outfit them with the equipment they needed to survive the horrors of war, and train them to the extent needed to emerge victorious, was a completely different thing. He began to wonder about how Marcellus could afford such an expense. It was at this moment he realized something. There was a new product that had entered the Eastern Roman Empire recently, and it came from the West. While they were covertly planning to overthrow Marcellus, they still traded with the Western Roman Empire. This new product, which sold for a high price, was called fortified wine and was imported en masse from Ravenna. Marcellus had gotten the idea to blend his distilled spirits with wine, and create a tasty beverage that had a greater kick to it. Because of this, he had made a fortune over the past few months, and used to it fund his rearmament process. To Frigi, this was the only explanation he could come up with for how the West had gained the capital to fund their new army and its development. He immediately felt like cursing whoever the hell was responsible for this newest form of alcoholic beverage. Since he could not convince Odin to lend his aid to the East, Frigi would have to return to Constantinople with his head hanging low. He had failed to achieve the goals that the regent had set out for him. The man in question would not be pleased when he learned of this fact. However, this diplomatic visit was not a total failure as he learned the reality of the threat that lay on the western border. 50,400 legionnaires organized to the standards of the Principate, and armed with the latest weapons and armor, as well as 60 to 80,000 Gothic federati guarding Noricum and Rhaetia. It was a mighty force to contend with, but still nowhere near in size compared to the troops the Eastern Roman army had available to it. Though Frigi had suffered a minor setback, he was positive he could still overcome the Western Roman army through sheer force of numbers if he had to. However, the cost to this was leaving Anatolia and Palestine available for conquest by the Sassanids. Ultimately, this was not his concern. He would leave the boy emperor and his regent with this headache. Either they found a solution to deal with Marcellus, or they accepted his bribe and waited for a later date to strike. Chapter 73 The Distillation Business. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the heart of the Western Roman Empire, Marcellus and Placidia were going over the nation's ledgers. Since he had first seized control of the Western Roman Empire, or at least the heartland of it, Marcellus had begun the establishment of a large distillery capable of producing copious quantities of alcohol for sale to the public. Normally this would be a lengthy process, but there were already vacant buildings set up that he could easily establish several large distilleries. The process surprisingly went smoothly, and within a month he was making profits. Unfortunately, it was not as much as he expected. The distilled spirits produced by Marcellus' production plants did not initially sell well. When compared to the taste of wine, many Romans found the heavy drink to be unappealing and outright bitter. Only the heaviest of alcoholics enjoyed the beverage. Marcellus had tried to think of a workaround to get people to purchase this amazing product, and in the end it was Placidia who came up with the idea of finding a way to mix it with wine. Ultimately, he decided to practice the principles of distillation and apply them to wine, where after several experiments he came out with a brandy-like product, which had become infinitely more popular than his previous malt whiskey. Further experimentation of blending this brandy-like product with red wine created a fortified wine that had become popular among all people within the Roman Empire. From the cities off the coast of Iberia to Jerusalem itself, people of all ages were drinking this new product with gusto. This new fortified wine that only Marcellus and his staff knew how to produce became popular almost overnight, and in the months since its initial manufacture had been transported all across the Western and Eastern Roman empires. This brought a considerable profit to the Western Roman Empire, which Marcellus used to invest in the military. It was because of this that Marcellus could afford to raise 3,000 cataphracts, and 54,000 legionaries. It was not just the military that Marcellus invested in, but agricultural technology as well. His plan was to produce enough heavy plows and horse bridles to supply as many fields as possible. So that come spring, he could quickly introduce all the new methods he had dreamt of that could aid in agricultural production. Marcellus and Placidia were currently gazing at the reports of the prophets, and were absolutely stunned at the results. They could not produce enough fortified wine to meet the demand, and because of this, the existing bottles were selling for a premium. People were willing to pay over 10 solidi for a single bottle of the substance. It was the ultimate luxury good for the patrician class. Marcellus sold this fortified wine in 750 milliliter ceramic bottles which used cork plugs. He had imported the cork from his newfound subjects in Iberia to produce proper seals for the wine. Such a thing was another invention that Marcellus introduced from his dreams. Placidia tallied up the numbers and realized by simple exploitation of the wealthy elite, they had sold 30,000 bottles of fortified wine for 300,000 solidi. In 3 months, they had manufactured and exported these 30,000 bottles of fortified wine across the empire. This was only made possible because of the millions of slaves that existed in the borders of the Western Roman Empire who were used in large numbers in every step of the manufacturing. Placidia had a pretty smile on her face as she outlined this in detail. Marcellus, from the sales we have made of fortified wine, we have made 300,000 solidi in the past 3 months. If we continue our current rate of production, we may be able to strengthen the economy from a point of near collapse to a point of stability within 3 to 5 years. That's not to mention the income we have received from the new pottery you have introduced. It would appear that it has become fashionable to drink the fortified wine from chalices made of this so-called porcelain. For the first time in decades, the economy of the empire is looking promising. 300,000 solidi was more than the Roman senators had agreed to pay Alaric in ransom months prior. That meant that in the past 3 months Marcellus' treasury had gained over 4,000 pounds of gold, simply from the sale of fortified wine. Marcellus was dreadfully happy when he heard this news and immediately reacted by walking over to the 15-year-old girl before lifting her into the air while swinging her around. He promptly kissed her on her forehead before sitting her back down in her seat. "That's great news, Placidia. You do not know how happy that makes me." The girl flushed red in embarrassment over what had just occurred. She was just about to speak up and make a personal request when the sound of a jealous lover harumphed in the room's entrance. Sigfrida was standing in the doorway with a displeased expression on her pretty face. She was no longer dressed in simple rags, but was instead garbed in the elegant silk trappings of an Eastern noblewoman. Since had gained her freedom and was officially made the concubine of the emperor, she decided to dress the part. She had a furious gaze in her ice-blue eyes as she stared at her partner before speaking up about her reason for intruding. "Ahem. I just wanted to let you know that I have decided to accept your request." Marcellus merely scoffed when he heard this. It had been months since he requested the woman to lead his newly reformed frumentarii. During this time, his agents had been trained in covert espionage, but were also lacking coordination. Because of this, Marcellus did not know what intel was viable, and what wasn't. Still, he was happy to see the woman come to her senses and walked over to her before planting a kiss on her lips. Sigfrida instantly marked her territory in front of the little girl that would soon be her lover's wife. She was exceptionally erotic with her kiss, which only caused Placidia to pout on the side. Marcellus did not notice this and instead questioned his concubine for the reason behind her sudden change of heart. "What finally changed your mind? I've been pestering you for months about this. Now, all of a sudden, you decide to accept my offer." Sigfrida stared into Marcellus' olive-green eyes, before shifting her gaze over to Placidia. She sighed heavily and muttered under her breath in a voice so low she thought the man would not hear her. "I didn't want to be a burden, that's all." Despite what she expected, Marcellus did in fact hear the woman's statement and coddled her while teasing her for her words. "Oh, that's so cute. My sweet Siegfrieda is always looking after me. Siegfrieda immediately fought out of Marcellus' grasp and pouted as she crossed her arms in discontent. She did not enjoy being teased by the man, but it was part of the job. Marcellus noticed she was in a rather foul mood and decided to be serious. All right, well, I want you to coordinate with Falconius. He knows the ropes and will be able to teach you what you need to know to complete the task. Essentially, you are the spymaster behind the web, so do whatever you feel is necessary to gain the information on my enemies while sabotaging their efforts to conspire against me. Siegfrieda nodded her head with a serious expression on her face. She threw up a clumsy salute as she responded in the affirmative. Yes, sir. This reaction caused Marcellus to smile and tug on the woman's cheek while teasing her once more. Envied, you are so cute when you try to be serious, Siegfrieda merely scoffed and departed from the room. She had better things to do than be tormented by Marcellus' constant teasing. She decided that she would immediately meet up with the man named Falconius and learn spy craft from him. As for Placidia, she was pouting. The moment Siegfrieda entered the room, her fiancé acted like she didn't even exist. Marcellus was still smiling from his interaction with his lover when he turned around and witnessed the fury in the young woman's eyes. He immediately got defensive when he saw the way Placidia was staring at him. What? Did I do something wrong? Placidia merely scoffed in response before condemning him for his actions. You and Siegfrieda appear to get along well together, Marcellus felt awkward. He did not believe he had ever actually stated to his fiancée that Siegfrieda was his lover. He thought it was obvious enough. Naturally, Placidia knew this fact well. She had been watching with envy as Marcellus chased after Siegfrieda since she was a small child. Even though she would finally be marrying the man she loved in a few months, she knew that it was a simple matter of political convenience. Ultimately, Marcellus still thought of the girl as a little sister, and that would not change overnight. Marcellus noticed the girl's troubled expression and inquired further about it. Do you want to talk about it? Placidia merely shook her head and opened up the next ledger while chastising Marcellus for his lack of work ethic. If you have time to ask about it, you have time to work. Stop being lazy like my brother, and do your job. The remark was rather harsh, but he could tell his actions with Siegfrieda had offended the girl. He could only bite his tongue and do as his little fiancée instructed. Thus Marcellus quickly got back to work looking over the ledgers of his empire's finances. Chapter 74 Meeting with the Ruling Class. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Since Marcellus first assumed the role of emperor, he had been met with resistance at every corner. Though he butchered the Senate, and crucified those who were engaged in extensive corruption, these brutal actions had not entirely deterred the wealthy elites from conspiring against him. The Frumentarii had been reorganized to infiltrate these small conspiracies, and now, under the direction of Siegfrieda, they had gained much viable intel. The most recent threat report shows that many of these conspiracies had been abandoned. Largely due to the massive economic upturn that was beginning to take place as a result of the distillation and pottery business that Marcellus had introduced. In particular, the pottery was being sold not only in Roman borders, but across the Sassanid Empire and all the way to India. With the most criminally corrupt officials being removed from the Roman bureaucracy and replaced with those who had merit, as well as accumulation of silver and gold that was being circulated across the Western Roman Empire, thus improving its economy, many of these patrician clans were changing their opinion about Marcellus and his dictatorship. In a few short months, Marcellus had gotten rid of 2 of the 3 threats their realm faced, earned the loyalty of the Theodosian rebels in Hispania, stabilized the economy, to the point where it was no longer on the verge of collapse, and had begun the process of rebuilding the Roman army to its former glory. That's not to say that there weren't many problems that plagued the Western Roman Empire, but for the first time in many years, it was no longer rushing towards the cliff, and had instead taken a slow stroll towards its edge. Months had passed since the Eastern Roman Empire met with the Huns, and as a result they were forced to accept Marcellus' bribe. For the time being, the Eastern Roman Empire would focus its military on the threat to the east. With Placidia's engagement to Marcellus, and the rapid expansion of the Roman army, the young emperor of the East, or more accurately, his mother was unwilling to risk an attack on the west while the Sassanids were still pestering her forces on her eastern borders. This relieved pressure from the Eastern Roman Empire allowed Marcellus to spend the winter mustering his forces so that they could march into Gaul in the late spring, or early summer. As a result, Marcellus had formed a brief, yet stable peace during the winter of 408 AD. The Western Roman Empire were capable of living in peace without fear of a serious barbarian invasion into their heartland. Today Marcellus rose with the dawn, as he normally had. This time, the warm spring air assailed his olive flesh, causing him to form a pleasant smile on his face as he climbed out of his bed. Spring had finally arrived, and with it, he could begin to introduce his agricultural innovations across the territory he currently held. After spending the morning exercising in the palace's yard, and eating a meal with his fiancée and concubine, Marcellus soon found himself in a meeting with several wealthy landowners. In the late Roman Empire, the precursor to feudalism had taken shape, with most plebeians being tied to the lands of their local patricians. It was these men that Marcellus had to convince to introduce his agricultural advancements. Among these men who were gathered, many were names whom Marcellus recognized from the reports written by his frumentarii. Some of these men had previously conspired against his rule, but had withdrawn their support after the economy improved, while others were still actively engaged in plots against the emperor. Marcellus did not care in the slightest. Those who made an attempt on his life, or those close to him, would be eliminated before they could pull it off. For the moment it was more important to convince these men to obey his commands. While these wealthy men gathered in the royal palace dressed in their fine silk clothes, Marcellus wore his signature armor. It was this air of militancy that caused many of the men in this room to despise him. Marcellus was more of a military dictator than he was an emperor. The people did not recognize his rule, but what remained of the Roman army did, ensuring he had the power to act as he pleased. By Marcellus' side were two members of his elite guard. Though Marcellus was reviving the concept of the legions, he was not returning to the ways of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was responsible for the deaths of too many past emperors, including Aurelian. Thus, he continued to make use of the Palatini, or palace guards, who were the most elite and loyal members of his army, selected to personally protect him. The emperor sat at a large table across from the wealthy landowners who had, until now, acted with impunity in the domains they ruled over. He cleared his throat before addressing the men who sat across from him with varying expressions. "I know you are all wondering why I have summoned you to Ravenna. So allow me to make this clear: we have developed new agricultural technology that will increase food production significantly. It is because of this that I wish to spread it across the realm. Naturally, since many of you either own the land, or have been placed in charge of it, I must ask you to make use of this new technology so that the empire can prosper. I have already paid for the construction of the equipment and have stockpiled it during the winter. While this winter was mild, compared to others, we have still lost many of our citizens to starvation. It is with this in mind that I want you all to make use of these new innovations to increase food production so that no Roman will ever starve again." In response to this, one man in particular scoffed before speaking his mind. Whether he was mad to condemn the dictator of Rome to his face, or just did not care about the consequences, the man spoke of a matter which caused Marcellus great pain. "And whose fault is that? All those people who died, they were from villages that you and your army of rebels ransacked on your journey to Ravenna. You think we have such short memories that we don't remember who is responsible for this man-made famine that plagues our lands?" Marcellus frowned when he heard this and glared at the man intensely. He sighed heavily before responding to the man's insults with a stern tone in his voice. "While it is true that my army was forced to ransack Roman villages like a band of common brigands, let's not forget who put me in such a position. Had Honorius not kidnapped my mother and demanded I hand myself over to him for an unjustifiable execution, I would have gladly marched on Ravenna in the spring, when my armies were well provided for, by the very agricultural innovations I am trying to introduce. I understand you lost a brother during my campaign against corruption. I am certain you resent me very much. However, it is not my fault that those people starved, it is my predecessors. I suggest you be careful with your accusations, or else your words may come across as outright slander. Need I remind you what happened to the Senate when they tried to steal from me my right to rule? The tension in the air was like a guillotine hanging above the patricians' necks. It was not just this one man Marcellus was threatening, but everyone in the room. Like a true dictator, he wasn't giving them a choice in the matter. Either they would introduce his agricultural reforms, or he would replace them with men who would. The man who had previously spoken up against Marcellus and his past actions could not find his voice. The intense glare that Marcellus was giving him was one of an apex predator who had caught a hare in his sights. Would the hare provide sustenance to such a massive beast? Hardly, but it would be fun to tear it apart, nonetheless. A cold sweat broke out on the man's brow as he realized the situation he was in. This new Roman Empire was no longer ruled by codified laws and the people's consent, but by the iron fist of a tyrant. At any moment, the guards in this room could turn their blades upon him and everyone else. This very thought convinced the man to bow his head and apologize for his remarks. I am sorry, I was out of line. I will do as you have requested. A smug smile formed on Marcellus' lips as he heard this. He then nodded his head and shifted his fearsome gaze onto the other patricians. Are there any other complaints? There was a universal shaking of the heads, as the patricians were too frightful of the consequences should they voice their thoughts aloud. Upon seeing this, Marcellus stood up from his seat and walked towards the door. The rest of the men in the room sat frozen in their chairs, too afraid to even look at the man who ruled over them. Marcellus abruptly stopped right when he reached the door before leaving one last remark. I will have the devices delivered to your fields. As for the matter of the three-field system, it will be properly explained to you and your farmers when the devices arrive. Until then, you may either stay in the city or return to your homes. What you do from now on is no concern to me. After saying this, Marcellus left the room where the patricians universally sighed in relief. They never knew how fearsome the man was until they met him in person. Chapter 75 Time waits for no man. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Since he had forced the land-owning patricians to implement his agricultural reforms, Marcellus kept a low profile. Rarely leaving the palace, he secluded himself from the safety of his home. While conspiracies raged across Italia, and the Frumentarii sabotaged their efforts, Marcellus just needed to wait out the clock until the time of the spring harvest. However, time waits for no man, and in early spring, shortly after sowing his crops, Marcellus received word from the Theodosian rebels that Constantine seized one of their major cities, cutting off the cork supply to the Roman heartland. In response to this, Marcellus had no choice but to act. Without cork the sale of his wine would decrease in value, as it was an effective way to preserve the flavor and alcohol content of the wine. This meant his economy, which was just starting to get back on track, would take a hit. As a result, Marcellus stood before the army, which he had painstakingly built since his rise to power as the emperor of Western Rome. 50,400 men stood within the city of Ravenna, armed from head to toe in the latest advancements in armor and weapons that money could buy. These were no longer simple conscripts but dedicated legions. They were professional soldiers who were paid a living wage to protect the borders of the empire. Marcellus stood at the balcony of his palace and greeted the men who wore the colors of their legions proudly. He saluted the men from his balcony while uttering his speech. As you are all aware, Flavius Claudius Constantinus has long since taken up arms in rebellion. Currently, because of this man, our empire stands divided. With Gaul and Britannia currently under the usurper's control. Recently, I have incorporated Hispania back into the control of our empire. However, I regret to inform you that the usurper has made gains in the region, and has cut off the supply of a critical resource from Hispania. Without this resource, our economy will struggle, and it is because of this that I have taken precautions to procure supplies from the east so that we may fight a campaign against the usurper and bring an end to his tyranny once and for all. I have gathered you all here today for one reason. To march you through the borders of Italia and into Gallia, where we shall meet the usurper from behind. Combined with our troops in Hispania, we shall encircle the enemy, and claim his head. I have trained you for this very moment, and I have faith in your ability to complete your duties. Rise, soldiers of Rome, and bring an end to this war. The soldiers immediately returned the salute of their emperor and raised their shields in unison, pounding their iron rims onto the floor over and over again while chanting the words. Hail Augustus! Augustus being the title given to late Roman emperors, with Caesar being the term given to their company emperors. With this, Marcellus' army was prepared to march, and he descended from the staircase, only to be greeted by Sigefrida and Placidia, who both had worried expressions on their faces. Placidia was the first to hug her fiancé, jumping ahead of Sigefrida as if it were a serious matter. Be safe. I don't want to lose you before we can even get married. Marcellus chuckled when he heard this, and kissed the girl on the forehead, before shoving off her embrace and offering his arms to his concubine. Though she was upset that Placidia got the jump on her, she reluctantly hugged the man, and kissed him on the lips before whispering in his ear. Don't get captured this time. Marcellus laughed once more before he rustled the woman's hair, before shoving her away. You can relax. I never make the same mistake twice. As the leader of his Frumentarii, Sigefrida would have to sit back in Ravenna during this campaign, and work on keeping the numerous conspirators at bay, while searching for evidence to convict them on. She was no longer a slave, and thus no longer had the ability to be a part of the army's followers' camp. Understanding her position, Sigefrida sighed before letting her man walk out towards his army. Marcellus waved goodbye as he hopped on his steed's back and set off for war against the usurper. He vowed in his heart that he would not be defeated this time around. Luckily for him, his army was made of completely loyal Roman soldiers, seeing as how the Foederati were guarding the borders in the east. Thus, he could wage this war with a sense of civility that had not been present in recent years of conflict. In the early spring of 409 AD, the Western Roman army, under the command of Emperor Titus Claudius Marcellus, marched westward into Gaul. While Marcellus and his army marched towards Rome, the troops in Hispania who had sworn their loyalty to Marcellus were defending the city of Saguntum. After finally breaking the stalemate between the two forces, Constantine's army had gained the morale needed to push further into Hispania. Currently, the two sides were engaged in a brutal siege. However, much like the last one, this siege had started off poorly for the usurper and his army. Constantine did not know that by cutting off the supply of cork to Italia, he had summoned an army of wolves at his back. Nor was he aware that an agreement had been reached between the Theodosian loyalists and the dictator in Ravenna. His spy network had failed to infiltrate the capital. Instead, he truly believed Marcellus was still licking his wounds, in fear that the Eastern Roman Empire would invade his lands at any minute. Thus, his renewed campaign in Hispania was based on a miscalculation of his many enemies and their positions. Because of this, the loyalists in Hispania waged a war of attrition, stalling the enemy's advance for as long as possible, and keeping Constantine's focus on Hispania. The goal was not to defeat the usurper but to keep him chasing after them so that they could trap him in Hispania and eliminate him once and for all. This war of attrition was slowly draining Constantine's remaining insanity, and at the moment the man was chewing his fingernails and cursing at his soldiers as they fell down from the missile fire that originated from the city's walls. God damn it. Can't any of you fucking aim your bows properly? Why are we losing so many men? The Frankish chieftain Hagen spat on the ground in discontent. Throughout this entire campaign, Constantine had only become more unnerved. It was a miracle that they had even captured the previous city, and it was by no means a glorious victory. A lot of men had perished taking the city, so much so that Hagen had begun to expect the Theodosian loyalists abandoned it on purpose. After all, many of their men had fled before the city was fully taken. Those same men were fighting here today, with as stiff as resistance as they initially encountered in the last city. Something wasn't adding up. Unfortunately, he did not have accurate information on the actions that the Theodosian loyalists were taking. He also did not know why the loyalists had not surrendered after learning of Honorius's death. According to Constantine, they had vowed to fight until the bitter end, regardless if the news about the emperor's demise was true. However, if that was the case, they would not have abandoned the previous city so quickly. Unfortunately, none of Hagen's concerns were taken seriously by Constantine, and he worried about the future of this campaign. As the voice of reason, he tried to calm the self-proclaimed emperor. Your Majesty, with all due respect, we should cease our assault any longer and our losses will be too severe to continue. We will just have to find another way to take this city. Though Constantine wanted to scold his Federati commander for his perceived cowardice, he noticed the piles of dead soldiers that belonged to his forces lying in pools of their own blood beneath the city's ramparts, and sighed in defeat before calling off the attack. Retreat. Retreat back to the camp. With this, the trumpets were blown, and the signal to retreat was given. Constantine's army was once more halted at the gates of Saguntum. Upon seeing his soldiers return to the siege camp battered and bloodied from the conflict, Constantine could not help but curse his luck. God damn it! What kind of shit of luck is this? Do the heavens really favor the Theodosian dynasty that much? If so, why would they permit the death of Honorius? No, I refuse to believe that God is on the side of my enemies. Hagen listened to the pathetic rant of the little Roman man and could not help but mutter his thoughts under his breath. The gods do not favor a fool. Luckily Constantine didn't hear these words or he might do something foolish that would force the Frankish Federati to leave his service. Ultimately, Hagen could only sigh before speaking words of encouragement to the remaining soldiers in the army. We will just have to formulate a better assault plan for tomorrow. With this said, the usurper and his army tried their best to come up with a better plan that would allow them to seize Saguntum. They were completely unaware that an army of 50,400 Roman legionaries was approaching from behind them. Chapter 76 Marching on Hispania. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus gripped the hilt of his spada as he sat on horseback. He had long since set forth from Italia to invade Gaul and catch the usurper Constantine III in the mountains that bordered Hispania. As he suspected, the moment after his army deployed beyond the borders of the Roman heartland, they had to deal with unruly groups like the Bagaudae and the various Germanic tribes who ravaged the land Constantine was supposed to protect. He had just now received word that a group of Vandals had attacked his scouts and forced them to retreat towards the main line. There were roughly 3,000 of the enemy in total, and as a result Marcellus led his heavy cavalry forward into the front, to eliminate the minor threat. Since he was now the emperor, Marcellus no longer had the ability to fight at the front lines. Something that was usually discouraged by Roman generals, but he had picked up from his interactions with the Gothic Federati. Marcellus's steed stood on a hilltop above, while the man himself gazed down at the Vandal encampment with a hint of disdain in his eyes. He immediately caught the interest of the barbarians within, who were worried at the sight of a lone Roman rider. On the other side of the hill were the 5,000 cataphracts Marcellus had raised since his rise to power. When the Vandals noticed him on the hills above, he rode back down the hill before giving the order to charge. Kill them all. With this, an army of 5,000 cataphracts descended down the hillside with a single goal in mind: the total annihilation of this Vandal army. The barbarians began to panic the moment they saw so many cavalry rushing down their position. When they had raided the Roman scouts in the past, they did not know that they were just a small attachment to a massive invasion force. The first instinct was to flee for their lives, but with the speed of the horses, they would never get far. As a result, the men grabbed their spears and shields and tried to form a shield wall, which they barely managed to achieve. However, against the heavily armed horses, and their riders who couched their lances beneath their arms, there was no possible way such a hastily formed defense could protect them. The shocked cavalry smashed through the Vandals' defenses and skewered them with their lances, punching through their measly armor, assuming they had some, and skewering them on the ground. The entire gulch where the Vandals had set up camp became a bloodbath. Marcellus gazed from the hill above and watched the entire massacre with his elite guard riding by his side. He snapped the reins of his horse and immediately began to ride back to his host, no longer caring to witness the slaughter that was taking place below. His guards quickly followed him, protecting him from any potential hostiles as they regrouped with the main force. When Marcellus arrived with nothing but a small attaché of guards in tow, his generals immediately began to panic and quickly questioned him about the results of the battle. "Where is the rest of the cavalry? What happened?" Upon seeing that Primus was flustered, Marcellus merely chuckled as he stopped his horse parallel to the man before placing a palm on his shoulder. "No need to worry. The Vandals were not expecting retaliation. We caught them with their pants down and put them to the sword. The cataphracts are simply cleaning up what remains." Primus immediately sighed with relief as he heard the report from the field and immediately ordered his troops to continue their march towards Hispania. The cavalry were on horseback, and because of this, there was no reason to halt their advance. "Why have you bastards stopped? Continue forward." Not wanting to anger the legatus, the individual soldiers continued to march forward without fear in their eyes. Marcellus gazed at the sight of the iron-clad warrior who wore Burkasovo-style helmets and scaled armor over their subarmalis. They looked like a genuine Roman army on par with those from the Principate, with standard-issued equipment, and matching painted shields per legion. No longer were these the days where a man would only wear the armor he could afford. This was a true gathering of legions with a single purpose in mind, complete and total annihilation of the enemy. Marcellus, who sat upon horseback, felt a sense of pride in his heart for fostering such a capable force. For the first time in a long time, the Roman legions of a bygone era were back in the field. Each man marched in perfect tune to those surrounding them, in large columns, as they passed through the war-torn wastes of Gaul. They did not bother striking at small villages, or besieging cities in the area, and the garrisons within were too afraid to hamper their advance. The only actions that were taken were eliminating the messengers sent to Hispania to prevent news of their advance from reaching the usurper before it was too late. After months of brutal training, the 9 legions that were present, and numbered from Legio I to Legio IX, were well conditioned to long marches in their armor. Like the days of old, they were expected to put on their armor after rising from their beds, and wear it throughout the entire day, even during an intense period of labor, until the moment they went to sleep. Such training had given them the stamina and endurance to march into Hispania without being cumbered by their equipment. Something the past armies Marcellus once commanded under Honorius' reign, no doubt, would have been unable to accomplish without a severe rate of attrition and complaining. In every century there was a man with a red-plumed helmet. These men were centurions, a man capable of reading, writing, and having gone through lengthy training to become an officer. They existed among the ranks of the Roman forces, proudly displaying their unique helmets. Marcellus could not help but admire what had been accomplished in such a short time frame. However, he lamented the fact that centurions were hard to come by, as most Roman citizens no longer knew how to read or write. It was the belief of Marcellus that once his economy had improved significantly, there would need to be an educational reform, allowing him a greater pool to select officers from in the future. For the time being, he made do with what was available. Each man here had been indoctrinated to believe that Marcellus was the only man capable of keeping the empire from falling apart, and that their blood, sweat, and tears were needed to accomplish this. Thus, as they passed by their emperor, who sat on horseback, each soldier threw up a salute while marching, showing him the respect they had for him. Eventually, the cavalry regrouped with the army, taking their spoils from the Vandal encampment. Evidently, these 3,000 barbarians had been quite the raiders, as they had a significant amount of gold and silver hoarded away. The cavalry presented all the assets they had seized to Marcellus as the infantry marched by. "Your Majesty, we present to you with the spoils we have taken from the enemy encampment. It seems to be a decent worth of loot." Marcellus merely nodded his head in agreement as he motioned for his soldiers to stack it into the wagons that carried the supplies. "Any spoils we may obtain on our journey are to be handed over to logistics. They will ensure that they are well looked after until we return home." The cavalry instantly saluted their emperor before riding off and depositing the looted goods with the necessary department. After doing so, they regrouped into their appropriate position among the army and continued their journey towards the Pyrenees. Marcellus' plan was to capture the mountain passes, and prevent Constantine and his army from fleeing back into Gaul. Once they were trapped in between the loyalists of Hispania and the main army of western Rome, both forces would attack simultaneously and slaughter Constantine and what remained of his army. It would still take several days before Marcellus and his army reached the mountains, but the troops in Hispania were already made aware of their advance, and were merely holding out in Saguntum to buy time for their arrival. When Marcellus arrived, he would dispatch a messenger to the forces of Hispania. The letter would contain orders to use all their might to drive the broken forces of the usurper back to the Pyrenees so that they may meet their deaths at the hands of the new emperor. However, things did not always go as planned, and it was impossible to say whether or not Constantine could escape yet another encirclement. After all, the last time Marcellus and Constantine clashed, the usurper managed to best him. Something Marcellus swore not to repeat in this assault. Chapter 77 Separate Ways. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Time had passed since Marcellus and his soldiers first entered Gaul, enough time for them to finally enter the Pyrenees. Aside from a few small conflicts with brigands and barbarians, they arrived at their destination with few losses. The soldiers of Marcellus' legions were high in morale as they entered the mountain range and cut off Constantine's ability to escape. The plan was simple. Dispatch a messenger to the allied troops in Hispania, informing them to begin their counterattack so that they can push the usurper and his armies back to the mountains where they would be caught between Marcellus' troops and those of Hispania. Thus, for the time being, Marcellus had established a camp at the foothills of the mountains where his army lay in wait for the enemy. Marcellus sent multiple messengers out to his allies to ensure that they reached the destination. After all, they would have to travel around Constantine's forces to get to the soldiers of Hispania who currently hid behind their tall walls and defended their cities. At any point, Constantine and his army could intercept them. It was a dangerous task, but a necessary one. While Marcellus and the bulk of his forces sat in the foothills of the Pyrenees, Theseus was in the middle of defending Saguntum from the usurper's forces. He stood atop the ramparts and watched as the siege unfurled. For the 10th time in the past week Constantine had charged towards the walls, and for the 10th time he was failing to break through. Despite being equipped with battering rams and ladders, the soldiers of the usurper's army simply could not defeat the defenders of the city. It was only because they had pulled back from their previous position that Constantine could seize it and gain a major victory in Hispania. In reality, this was Theseus' way of goading Constantine deeper into his lands, to buy enough time for the new emperor and his so-called legions to catch Constantine from behind. With a sneer of disdain on his face, Theseus gazed at the volley of arrows that his city's defenders unleashed onto the hostile forces below. Though the enemy had their shields raised, it was still possible for the thousands of projectiles that were launched to pierce through the gaps and strike the flesh of those unfortunate enough to be lacking sufficient body armor. Like most forces in this apocalyptic time, Constantine's army was poorly equipped. Most of his men were lucky if they had a shield and helmet, let alone a shirt of mail. One by one, the projectiles whittled their numbers down. Just when Constantine was about to call back his forces, he heard an order being given from the ramparts above. "Light them up." Constantine was unaware of what this voice was referring to, but he recognized who it belonged to. Theseus had given the command for his soldiers to throw cauldrons of boiling pitch onto the soldiers who were climbing atop the ladders. Screams filled the air as the usurper's forces fell from the ladders in agony. However, that was not the worst of it. once the pitch had covered the walls of the fortress, and the dirt beneath the enemy's feet, a series of fire-lit arrows rained onto the substance and created a vast wave of flames that consumed much of Constantine's forces. He lost hundreds of men in that moment, forcing him to order the retreat once more. Retreat. Fall back to camp. The soldiers beneath Constantine's command did not hesitate, and left their burning brothers in arms to die a pitiful death. Too fearful that they might share a similar fate. Thousands of rebel soldiers regrouped at the camp, battered and exhausted. Hagen had practically had enough of Constantine's failures and was about to rebuke him when the gates to the city opened, and Theseus' army flooded the field, charging towards Constantine and his exhausted troops. Hagen immediately ordered his Frankish warriors to form a shield wall in his native tongue. Shield wall. Before he even gave the order, the battle-hardened barbarians had formed ranks, while their Roman allies crumpled under the pressure. The soldiers of Hispania were rapidly crossing the distance as they threw their plumbati into the air and onto the panicked forces of the usurper, causing many to fall where they stood. Theseus gazed upon the scene of his soldiers swarming the enemy encampment with a hint of pride in his eyes before looking at the message in his hands, and the heavily armored soldier who had delivered it to him. So the emperor has taken up residence in the Pyrenees. Very well, if his plan is to catch Constantine between our two armies, then I will be happy to oblige. Make no mistake, we will drive the usurper and his barbarian hordes straight into the emperor's lines, where we will fight together to put an end to his reign of terror. The messenger smiled viciously as he nodded his head. His scale armor clanked as he saluted the general from Hispania. Ave, true to Augustus. The messenger was slightly perturbed that the general of Hispania did not respond to him in kind. It was the common phrase that the soldiers of Marcellus' army used to greet each other. To refuse to say it was an insult to the soldiers of the new legions. Still, he did not hold Theseus accountable, and instead bowed his head before watching over the battle that ensuing below. One of Theseus' commander was leading from the rear. As his soldiers encircled Constantine's forces, at least partially, they made sure to leave a gap in the rear for them to escape. Constantine's Roman forces were on the brink of collapse, with the Frankish foederati holding the line. At any moment, they would begin to rout. Finally, after his left flank collapsed, and begun to flee for their lives, Constantine issued the order for a full retreat. Retreat. We can no longer take Saguntum. The usurper had lost too many forces in his previous siege, as well as the current one. With this sudden encirclement of his encampment, he no longer had the forces necessary to defend his position, let alone take the city. He had no choice but to withdraw to previously gained territory and conscript the locals for cannon fodder. Either way, Theseus had succeeded in breaking the siege, and had begun his counter-attack. Bodies lie piled outside the city's gates, and within the encampment that lie in the distance. Thousands of men fled for their lives, pursued by the hounds of Hispania. It was only after a horn blew in the air, signaling Theseus' troops to cease their pursuit that the usurper's forces could finally relax. Hagen was displeased, more than he was before his warriors risked their lives to hold the lines. He had lost well over 400 men in the brief engagement within their encampment. He immediately walked up to Constantine and punched him in the face, enraged by the losses he had suffered. "You damnable fool! Do you have any idea how many men I have lost in this fruitless campaign of yours? Hispania remains defiant, despite your best efforts to subjugate them, and we no longer have the forces to maintain a presence in the region. Our failure at Saguntum will be the rallying cry necessary for Theseus to raise more troops against us. We have no choice but to retreat to Gaul and lick our wounds. If we stay in Hispania, we will be defeated." Constantine was far from pleased with being struck by his foederati commander. Without thinking about the consequences, he made an order that he would soon regret. "Arrest this man. He has struck your emperor." The soldiers loyal to Constantine did not react to this command, they were too fearful of the Franks. After all, the Franks were better armed and more experienced in conflict. Not only that, They were the largest chunk of forces in Constantine's rebel army. No man would be foolish enough to provoke them over a much-deserved strike. When Constantine realized that no man in his army would follow his orders, he gritted his teeth in displeasure. As for Hagen, he towered above the puny Roman and shoved him onto the ground. I see you have made your choice. Fuck you. You are no emperor, you are just a sad little soldier pretending to be something you are not. I will return with my forces to Gaul and take what has been promised to me. My people have shed enough blood in this failed campaign of yours. With this said, the Frankish federati and the rebel soldiers split ways, with the Franks making the long trek back to Gaul, and Constantine stubbornly refusing to yield Hispania. Little did either of the two men know that the Pyrenees had been sealed by Marcellus' army, and they were now stuck between the forces of the emperor and his allies in Hispania who had not ended their pursuit. Dovico. Chapter 78 Unfair Negotiation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Constantine was furious after his federati had abandoned him at Saguntum and planned to return to Gaul. While it was true, this campaign was not going as well as he had initially planned, they were far from being defeated. Or so he believed. Constantine's plan was to fall back to the regions he had conquered and force every man capable of wielding a spear into his ranks. He had bled too much, and fought too long to lose Hispania after a series of protracted sieges. He swore he would be back with a vengeance. As for Hagen, he quickly gathered his Frankish warriors and departed for the Pyrenees. There was nothing left in Hispania for him, and he intended to raid and ravage Constantine's lands for all the wealth they had. Or so that was the plan. However, the moment he and his army of a few thousand federati arrived at the foothills they had passed through to get into these lands, they noticed a serious problem. Standing guard across the mountain passes were large numbers of Roman troops, and these were not reinforcements. The way they were armored was vastly superior to Constantine's greatest forces. Hagen was quite fearful of who this army belonged to, and what their purpose was. Had the Eastern Roman Empire sent its forces to cut off Constantine? No, that was not possible. Should the Eastern Roman Empire take such foolish action, they would be leaving their borders with the Sassanids defenseless. There was only one possibility for the existence of this army. Marcellus had raised his troops, and marched from Italia to end Constantine's reign of terror once and for all. This news honestly surprised Hagen. Shouldn't Marcellus be back in Italia licking the wounds from his rebellion, and doing everything in his power to stabilize his reign? The Frankish chieftain could hardly believe the self-proclaimed emperor had the means to march such a massive and well-equipped army westward. If Marcellus had so many soldiers guarding this one mountain pass, then they likely had others guarding the rest. At times like this, Hagen felt he should negotiate with the man. After all, fighting such a large number of Roman soldiers, and breaking through into the Pyrenees, was simply impossible for his warriors. Perhaps if they had not suffered such massive losses at Saguntum, they might be able to make a break for it, but such a thing was no longer an option. The Frankish chieftain immediately called out to one of his nearby warriors. "Fetch me a white flag. I wish to negotiate with whoever leads this army." The warrior immediately looked towards his commander with a hint of surprise on his face. "We are not going to fight them." Hagen could not help but scowl at the man and his lack of intelligence. The only thing he could do was scold him. "Do you think our paltry numbers have the ability to contend with the enemy in front of us? There must be at least 10,000 of them sitting there in that mountain pass. By all means, if you want to scout the other routes back to Gaul, feel free to do so, but if they have come all the way to Hispania, only to stand guard at the Pyrenees, then it is clear that they have sealed off all routes. They intend to trap Constantine here, between two armies, and annihilate the fool. I'd rather not die for Constantine after abandoning him to his fate." The Frankish warrior immediately felt like an idiot when he heard Hagen's reasoning for negotiation. He was convinced there was a reason that the man was in charge of their troops, and it wasn't just because he was the biggest and strongest of all of them. "I'll go get the white flag." Hagen merely sneered at the man in disdain before uttering his true thoughts. You do that. After a few minutes, the man returned with a white flag and handed it to Hagen, which the Frankish chieftain immediately accepted the gift before holding it proudly in the air as he fearlessly approached the Roman army. Ordius was the man tasked with leading the legions which guarded this sector of the Pyrenees and immediately noticed the large Frankish warrior approaching him with a white flag. From his observations, there were no Romans among the ranks of the men behind the flag-bearer. This could mean only one thing. Conflict had ensued between the usurper and his barbarian federati, causing the Franks to desert. Because of this he did not order an assault, and instead grabbed a white flag of his own. Flanked by soldiers he met the Frankish chieftain in the field between their two armies. Hagen smiled when he saw that the Romans were willing to negotiate and called out to Ordius as he greeted him. "I am Hagen, chieftain of the Franks. May I ask what your name is, and who you serve?" Ordius had a stern expression on his face as he responded to the man's question. "I am Gaius Licinius Ordius, legatus to the Emperor Titus Claudius Marcellus. I assume you are deserters, as I do not see the usurper or his men among your ranks. Would I be correct?" Hagen was slightly perturbed by being called a deserter, despite its accuracy. However, he squashed his discontent for the sake of negotiations and answered the man honestly. "Constantine, in his utter incompetence, has caused the deaths of thousands of my men. The loss at the Battle of Saguntum was the last straw. We rejected his claim to the throne and parted ways with the usurper. Now it appears the fool has trapped himself in Hispania between two major armies. He is doomed, and we want no part in it. I have no quarrel with you or your emperor. If you would allow us to peacefully return to Gaul, I promise to rule the territory that my tribe has been given in the name of this Titus Claudius Marcellus." Ordius did not trust a word that Hagen had spoken. Those who would so quickly desert their masters were worse than wild dogs. He had been dispatched to this area to protect the Pyrenees from Constantine and his forces. Though these men may claim to be deserters, who was to say that once given safe passage they decided to bide their time, and strike Ordius' legions while they were engaged with Constantine? It was because of this thought that Ordius would not allow these men passage through the mountains. Instead, he proposed a counter-solution. Ednel.co, I'm afraid I can't let you pass through the Pyrenees. No offense, but I do not trust the words of a self-proclaimed deserter. You have two options. Fight us, or lay down your arms and become our prisoners. Once we have dealt with Constantine, we will release you and your tribesmen beyond the borders of the Rhine. Hagen was displeased with these options. Being taken prisoner was an insult to the honor of his warriors, and on top of this, the Roman general had claimed that he and his men would be released beyond the Rhine. Meaning that the lands they had long since settled would be taken away from them. He could not help but protest this by gnashing his teeth and cursing Ordius. "You bastard! We were promised lands in Gaul to settle, we will not return beyond the Rhine. I would rather die here in Hispania than be forced out of my home by a bunch of filthy Romans." Ordius merely smirked when he heard this before commenting on Hagen's claims. "You were promised these lands by a usurper. As for the lands your people already settle west of the Rhine, you forfeited your rights to those lands the moment you sided with Constantine. It is the opinion of His Majesty Titus Claudius Marcellus that the Franks in Gaul should be removed from Roman lands and returned to Germania. I assure you we have the necessary power to achieve such a thing. Surrender or die, those are your only options." Hagen spat on the ground and walked away in silence. He would not accept such a deal. This Emperor Marcellus was even more unreasonable than Constantine. Hagen would not so brazenly attack this section of the Pyrenees. He did not have the men to succeed. It would appear he would have to align with Constantine once more if he wished to break through the mountain pass. Hopefully, he could regroup with the fool and warn him of Marcellus' plot to trap him before the soldiers of Hispania could catch up to them. As for Ordius, he would report this incident to Marcellus, causing the Roman under the man's command to become much more alert. Once Constantine became aware of the trap that was set for him, his best course of action would be to attack a section of Marcellus' forces, and break through before their enemies could encircle them. Only time would tell whose forces would be victorious in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Chapter 79 A Desperate Gamble. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After failing to negotiate his passing through the Pyrenees, Hagen and his Frankish warriors returned to Constantine's ranks. It was not a long journey, but enough time had passed that Marcellus was made aware of the Franks' attempt to desert. Currently, Hagen stood before the self-proclaimed emperor, who had a smug smile on his face. The moment the usurper saw the Franks return to his army, he desired nothing more to gloat, which is what he was doing now. Oh! Back so soon. And here I thought that you and your army would be in Gaul by now. What happened? Did you suddenly realize where your loyalties should lie? Hagen was instantly displeased by the shit-eating grin on Constantine's face, and immediately informed him of what he had come to learn. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers belonging to Titus Claudius Marcellus blocked the Pyrenees. It is an army assembled for a single purpose: to trap us in Hispania and eliminate us once and for all. Since I could not penetrate through their defenses with my pitiful numbers, I figured the only chance either of us have of survival is to work together and break through one of the weaker defended routes. Constantine was no longer grinning when he heard these words. In fact, he was now scowling. He could hardly believe Marcellus had raised so many troops in such a short period of time. He instantly gnashed his teeth and began to rebuke Hagen for his perceived cowardice. Bah, an army of conscripts, nothing more. Clearly, you and your barbarian warriors are armed well enough to deal with them, even if they do outnumber you. No, there must be some other reason for your return. Hagen was thoroughly exhausted from Constantine's stupidity and began to scold the man for refusing to recognize reality. Every man was armored in a scale shirt and an iron helm. Many of them wore manica. These were no mere levies, but a well-armed, and well-trained force. By themselves, they could annihilate what remains of our army, especially after your disastrous campaign. However, you must be aware that we are also being pursued by the forces of Hispania. Their plan is clear. They seek to trap us in the foothills of the Pyrenees and encircle us with both armies. If we do not combine our forces and break through one of the segments of their army, we will all die. Why else would I return to your incompetent ass? For once in your life, listen to the words of your allies. Constantine was outright stunned by this news. It was simply unfeasible for Marcellus to raise such a massive, well-trained army in the span of a little over half a year. What did he do with conscript every young male capable of bearing arms and make them professional soldiers? Where did he even get the coin to finance such a massive undertaking? The man was so flabbergasted by this news he could only repeat the same word over and over again. Impossible. It is simply impossible. Hagen had finally had enough of Constantine's inaction, and backhanded him across the face in an attempt to bring him back to reality. Clearly it is possible, for we all saw it with our eyes. Now, are you going to sit here and wait to be surrounded? Or are you going to get up off your ass and find the best route to break through? Rather than awaken Constantine from his stupor, he collapsed into helplessness. He shook his head fervently, as Hagen grabbed onto his collar and stared into his mad eyes. You don't understand. I have already dispatched the bulk of my soldiers to recruit the plebeians of the land into my ranks. Yet they revolted when we tried to recruit them. In the ensuing rebellion, I lost 3,000 men. I no longer have the numbers to break through the armies who stand guard in the Pyrenees. It was Hagen's turn to be stunned this time. He immediately tossed the fool to the ground and cursed at him in disbelief. How the hell did you lose 1,000 soldiers to a bunch of fucking farmers? Constantine immediately backfired at Hagen's callous remarks with a hint of fury in his tone, as he got up and shoved the massive Frankish warrior aside. This is your fault. When you deserted along with your warriors, you destroyed what little morale my soldiers had left. Under threat of a rebellion and an encroaching army, they broke ranks and routed, stripping themselves of their gear, and fleeing to the countryside. I only have 4,000 men left who remain loyal to me. If what you say is true, they are bound to flee the moment they hear about their impending doom. We simply do not have the capabilities to fight against Marcellus and his army. Hagen was about to strangle Constantine, but was interrupted by an officer who rushed into the tent. Your Majesty, there are reports of Tacius scouts surveying our encampment. If we do not move from our position, we will be surrounded by nightfall, and will be forced to defend our current location to our deaths. We simply do not have the remaining men to prevail against our foes. Hagen immediately calmed his fury as he picked up the cowering usurper and dusted him off. Constantine was in no state to issue his orders. As such, Hagen took command as he ordered the officer to do the following. Gather every man and every horse we can find. We march for the Pyrenees. Our only chance now is to escape to Gaul. The soldier did not hesitate to question the orders of the Frankish chieftain, even if he had just deserted a few days prior. He was more concerned with his immediate safety rather than the reason for the Federati's return. It didn't help that Constantine was clearly out of his wits at the moment. The officer quickly saluted Hagen before departing, leaving behind his confirmation as he did so. Yes, sir. After the officer had departed and Constantine was alone with his Federati commander, he began to shriek in panic. Are you mad? Did you not just say that the mountains are guarded by Marcellus and his army? What sense does it make to go towards certain death? Hagen was in no mood to argue and instead fiercely glared before giving the command to the self-proclaimed emperor, who was about to soil himself in fear. If we stay here, we are as good as dead. At least there is a chance no matter how minute for a small portion of our forces to break through if we go through the mountains. Besides, I would rather die in battle on my own terms, rather than my enemies'. Get yourself prepared. We march as soon as we are able. In that moment Constantine could not find the strength to argue with his Federati commander. All he could do was pray that perhaps they might get lucky, and escape with their lives. As for Hagen, he swiftly left the tent and began to rally the troops, making up an easy excuse for his return so that he can provide them with some small glimpse of hope. With the Federati and Constantine's forces combined, they had roughly 7,500 troops left. In comparison, Marcellus had split his army into groups of 2 legions each, for a total of 12,000 men to secure the mountain passes that were large enough for an army of men to march through. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, Hagen truly believed that there might be a chance, no matter how small, that he could escape with his life. Hagen knew the likelihood was that the overwhelming majority of his men would die in this battle. He just needed a single instance where he could escape back to Gaul. He doubted Marcellus would expend much effort chasing down a single Frank. If he could return to Gaul, then he could raise the Frankish forces in rebellion against Marcellus' rule. After all, thanks to Ordius, Hagen knew that Marcellus intended to punish all Franks for their disobedience to the crown that now belonged to him. If he could return home with such knowledge, he would be able to unite the Franks against Marcellus but also, perhaps, even the Suebi. Such a large force of barbarian warriors would be more than enough to overwhelm northern Gaul and establish a true Frankish kingdom. Especially when Marcellus needed to focus on strengthening his grip over Hispania. Thus, while Marcellus sat back and waited for Constantine to fall into his trap, Hagen had already begun to plan not only his escape, but his rise to power. Whether he would be able to succeed was up to the gods. Still, in the mind of the Frankish chieftain, it was better to die trying than to sit and wait for his demise. As for Constantine, Hagen had already abandoned him the moment he deserted. That fool was nothing but a useful ally, to distract Marcellus and his forces while he escaped. Chapter 80 Breaking Through. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus sat within his encampment while drinking from a bottle of wine. By now, word had reached him about Ordius' encounter with the Franks. He was well aware of their intentions to flee, and had calculated for the variable. It was highly likely that Hagen returned to the army and convinced Constantine to break through the mountains, in a desperate gamble to save themselves. However, things weren't so easy. Out of his 9 legions, 8 of them were guarding the major mountain passes, with the last taking up a position higher up in the hills. Regardless of which route Constantine took, there would be 2 legions to face him, and a third to act as reinforcements. Now Marcellus did not know the exact numbers of Constantine's armies, but according to his allies in Hispania the fool had waged an unsuccessful campaign for control of the region and lost most of his army in his vain attempt at pursuing his so-called claim to the empire. What was that claim? The soldiers beneath his command considered him a better choice than Honorius, which wasn't saying much considering a half-wit would make a better candidate for an emperor than that idle fool. Aside from the support of Constantine's soldiers, the man had no real claim to the throne. What was Marcellus' claim? Conquest and marriage. It was infinitely stronger in the eyes of his peers than Constantine's. From a position of strength Marcellus forced the Eastern Roman Empire to recognize his rule over the West. Though it was impossible to say how long they would agree to Marcellus being the Western Emperor, it was better than Constantine, who was unrecognized by everyone but himself. Whether it was by fate, or sheer bad luck, Hagen led his forces directly to where Marcellus and his personal legions were established. Even the cataphracts were with their emperor. In the distance, the Frankish and Gallo-Roman forces gathered, staring in disbelief that the path they had chosen was the one of most fierce resistance. Hagen immediately complained about the situation to his scout. "You said this was the easiest path. Does this look like the safest route to you?" The scout gazed in disbelief. Just a week prior, when he scouted out the paths, there were noticeably fewer troops here. Now it appeared as if the emperor himself was standing in the way of this path. He tried to make excuses for his failures, but since he was a Roman, he was quickly beheaded by Hagen, who held the man responsible for their inevitable failure. Obviously, the scout had no way of knowing that Marcellus had played him for a fool. Marcellus decided that during his time camped out in the Pyrenees that he would rotate between the encampments. Naturally, his elite guard was right behind him, thus providing these 2 legions with an extra force. Constantine gazed in horror as the Frankish chieftain beheaded one of his scouts, but said nothing more. He realized the position he was in. By now, the enemy spotted their army, and even if they turned around, they would not be able to find another route before being intercepted by the soldiers of Hispania. Hagen swiped his bloody blade in the air and flicked the filth onto the ground before boldly making his speech to the men gathered. "The way is blocked. As are all the others. Before us stands one army, and behind us another. If we wish to survive, then we must break through. Gather your courage, and fight for your survival. Glory or death. Charge." After saying this, the combined army of Gallo-Roman soldiers and Frankish foederati rushed forwards towards the enemy army without a care in the world. The lack of organizational efforts on the enemy's behalf immediately surprised Marcellus. There was no method to their madness, just pure chaos. As for Marcellus, he waved his arm, and the trumpets blared, signaling to his soldiers to form ranks. Marcellus split his army into 2 legions. Each legion consisted of 10 cohorts of infantry split into 2 columns, with 2 cohorts of cavalry flanking the infantry, as well as a group of archers in the rear. Each legion had roughly 6,000 men in total and stood as a massive barrier for the enemy to cross through. While his warriors rushed forward and to their deaths, Hagen stayed at the rear with his elite guard, along with Constantine and what remained of his Palatini. The usurper gazed in horror as his army of roughly 7,500 men rushed towards the enemy without a thought in mind. He looked over at Hagen and questioned the man's stupidity. "That's your plan? To charge recklessly into the enemy's formation? He is using the old Marian system. With such well-equipped forces, our army is doomed. This is going to be a slaughter." Hagen glared at Constantine as if he was looking at an utter fool before snapping the reins and riding off. He did not even bother to explain his reasons. Constantine was forced into a situation: follow the Frankish chieftain, or lead his soldiers to their deaths. Naturally, he chose the former, and instantly rode after the man, along with what little cavalry he had left. Hagen's plan was simple. Send his army to their deaths, while he and his men rode up a more treacherous path. Though it was narrow and risked being crushed by falling rocks, it was unprotected. Why was it unguarded? Because it was impossible to march an army through the path. However, it was still entirely possible for a few dozen men to safely cross, if they were lucky. Thus, while Marcellus' army battled the reckless stupidity of Constantine's forces, the usurper, and his foederati commander absconded among the chaos. Not realizing that there was another legion in the mountains above waiting to intercept them, the Frankish warriors charged like rabid hounds towards the Roman shield wall. Arrows and plumbati alike fell upon them, riddling them with holes, and claiming their lives. Relatively few men wore body armor, and with such overwhelming missile fire it was impossible to block everything. Despite the deaths of hundreds of men, the remainder of the army boldly charged through the rain of arrows and war darts into the ranks of the enemy. The Gallo-Roman soldiers were completely unaware that their emperor had abandoned them from behind. To Marcellus, this battle was too easy, and thus he sat back and ordered commands. With the use of flags, he signaled for his front line to slowly recede back into the hills while the flanks surrounded the enemy. The cataphracts circled around the hillside and into the rear undefended mob of barbarians and traitors, skewering them with their couched lances. When stuck between a wall of heavy infantry and 4 cohorts of heavy cavalry, the enemy forces had nowhere to retreat. As men tried to break away from the chaos, they were cut down by the Roman spathi. What was supposed to be a battle turned into a massacre as the Roman forces continued to hold their formation and stab away at the torsos of every enemy they came across. With an oval shield in one hand, and a spatha in the other, the Romans worked like a well-oiled machine as they surrounded the enemy, pushed them back with their shields, and shoved their Noric steel blades into the enemy's abdomens, spilling their guts out onto the floor, along with all the blood and bile their body contained. Marcellus favored the double envelopment, and against an army that attacked without a care for tactics, it was extremely simple to pull off. Before the usurper's army even knew it, they were surrounded on all sides and being cut down like a bunch of whelps. Marcellus glared in disdain as he witnessed the fall of the usurper and his army. It turned out he did not even need the support of the soldiers of Hispania. While his army was being torn asunder, Constantine gazed in horror at the narrow steps above. He was forced to abandon his horse and hug the cliff side, like he had watched Hagen and his men do before him. The path was too narrow and too steep for a mount to trudge through. The man's heart bled as the army he spent so long cultivating was annihilated without mercy. Hagen, on the other hand, saluted his men as they fell to the Roman blades. "I will reunite with you all in Wotan's hall soon enough." Unlike the Gallo-Romans, the Franks knew they were walking into their deaths. Yet they proudly did so. They were more than willing to exchange their lives so that their chieftain and their most elite soldiers had a chance to escape. Thus, they fought with everything they had to kill as many Romans as possible on their way to the next life. However, that was easier said than done. The Romans had 2 layers of protective armor. On the outside was their larica squamata, which was a thick vest of iron scales. Below this vest was a form of padded armor, akin to a gambeson called a subarmalis. It was made of either quilted leather or textiles. If the Frank spears got past the Roman shields, then they would soon find themselves stopped by this protective barrier. Thus, despite their best efforts, only a few hundred of Marcellus' warriors fell in battle. By the time the usurper's forces were completely annihilated, Constantine and Hagen were nowhere to be found among the corpses, thus outraging Marcellus as he yelled towards his soldiers to locate his target. "Where is he? Where is the usurper?" A centurion who was tasked with checking the corpses shook his head in disbelief as he announced his failure. "I'm sorry, your majesty, but he is nowhere among the dead." Marcellus forcibly calmed his wrath as he issued new orders to his army. Send word to all troops to scour the mountains. I want that bastard found, and brought to me alive. Thus, a massive manhunt was about to take place in the Pyrenees. As for the dead, those who weren't a part of Marcella's army were left for the wolves.